Laos spent decades defined by distance, landlocked, mountainous, easy to bypass. Then, in December 2021, distance collapsed. A train crossed the Chinese border and reached Vientiane in just 4 hours, a journey that once took nearly a full day. Overnight, isolation turned into access. The China-Laos Railway changed where Laos sits in the world. And when a country becomes a corridor, the real question is, who benefits? To understand why this railway is significant, you need to understand what Laos has been working against for centuries. Laos is landlocked, but that's not the whole story. Plenty of landlocked countries thrive. Switzerland, Austria, even landlocked Mongolia has access to major rail networks. Being landlocked is a challenge, not a death sentence. What made Laos different was how it was landlocked. Imagine a country where roughly 70% of the land is mountains, hills, and plateaus, where rivers run north to south, but your neighbors and trade partners are east and west, where the Mekong River, your main artery, only connects you to other landlocked regions or flows toward borders you don't control. This is not just inconvenient geography, it's economic fragmentation. For most of Laos's modern history, moving goods internally was harder than moving them internationally. A truck traveling from the north to the south might spend 2 days navigating winding mountain roads. Seasonal flooding could cut off entire provinces. Even major cities felt disconnected from each other. And because Laos sits between Thailand, Vietnam, China, Cambodia, and Myanmar, it was always in someone's sphere of influence, but never quite integrated into anyone's economy. Think of Laos as a house built on a hill, surrounded by busy streets, but with no driveway. Everyone passes by. Few stop. Fewer still come inside. For decades, the solution was roads. Laos built them. International donors funded them. But roads have limits. They require constant maintenance on rough terrain. They're slow for freight. They don't scale well when you're trying to move volume. Tons of cargo, thousands of passengers, consistent schedules. Rivers were even less reliable. The Mekong is seasonal. Upstream, it's shallow. It doesn't connect to the industrial centers that matter. So Laos remained what geographers call weakly connected, near major markets, but not plugged into them. Then came a different idea. Not a road, not a river. A railway. Railways do something roads and rivers can't. They compress time and cost at the same time. A freight train can move the same amount of cargo as 100 trucks, using less fuel with more reliability. Passenger trains remove the variability of traffic, weather, and driver fatigue. Rail doesn't flood. It doesn't wash out as easily. And once it's built, it becomes a permanent economic backbone. For Laos, the question wasn't whether rail made sense. It was whether anyone would pay for it. Enter China. In 2016, Laos and China agreed to build a 414-kilometer railway linking Kunming in southern China to Vientiane, the capital of Laos. The route would follow a north-south trajectory through some of the most difficult terrain in Southeast Asia. Let's talk about what difficult actually means here. The railway required 75 tunnels. That's not 75 small passages. These are tunnels blasted through limestone mountains, some stretching for kilometers. One tunnel alone, the Friendship Tunnel at the border, spans nearly 10 kilometers and took over 4 years to complete. The line also needed 167 bridges, not overpasses, multi-span viaducts crossing valleys, rivers, and gorges, some over 500 meters long. Why so much infrastructure for such a short distance? Because the terrain of northern Laos is vertical. Roads wind around mountains. Railways have to go through them. And going through mountains means drilling, excavating, reinforcing, and waterproofing tunnels that can handle the weight of freight trains moving at 160 kilometers per hour. The entire railway passes through seismic zones. Engineers had to design for earthquakes. They had to account for monsoon rains that can destabilize slopes. They had to work in areas with limited road access, meaning materials and equipment had to be transported into remote construction sites. This railway wasn't built for convenience. It was built for continuity. The route was designed to extend south eventually, toward Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore. From China's perspective, this is a southern corridor into ASEAN markets. From Laos's perspective, it's the first real north-south economic artery the country has ever had. And here's the thing, people miss. The railway isn't valuable because it's fast. It's valuable because it's consistent. When the railway opened in December 2021, news stories focused on speed. Vientiane to the Chinese border in hours. Laos enters the high-speed age. But speed is only part of the picture. The bigger transformation is reliability. Before the railway, traveling from Vientiane to Luang Prabang, about 300 kilometers, took anywhere from 6 to 10 hours by bus, depending on road conditions, weather, and traffic. The train does it in under 2 hours, every time, on schedule. That predictability changes how people think about distance. A student in Luang Prabang can now attend university in Vientiane and visit home on weekends. A business person can attend meetings in multiple cities in the same day. A family can access better healthcare without relocating permanently. This is what economists call labor mobility. When people can move easily, they can access jobs, education, and services they couldn't before. Cities start functioning as networks instead of isolated hubs. Domestic tourism is another change. Laos has always had tourists, backpackers, adventure travelers, regional visitors. But internal tourism was limited because traveling between cities was time-consuming and uncomfortable. Now, a family in Vientiane can take a weekend trip to Luang Prabang. A group of friends can explore northern Laos without renting a car or enduring a long bus ride. Tourism revenue that once flowed only to a few gateway cities starts spreading. There's also an urban concentration effect happening. When transport improves, cities grow. People migrate toward economic centers because they know they can reach them affordably and reliably. Vientiane's population has been growing steadily since the railway opened. Luang Prabang is seeing more investment in hospitality and services. Smaller towns along the route are starting to position themselves as stopover points. None of this is revolutionary. It's what happens when infrastructure removes friction. But here's the part that matters more. The railway didn't just move people faster. It changed how goods move. And that's where the story gets more complex. Passenger rail gets attention because it's visible. People experience it. They post about it. And freight rail is where the real economic leverage lives. In 2022, its first full year of operation, the China-Laos Railway moved 11.2 million tons of cargo. By 2023, that number jumped to 17.8 million tons. By 2024, it reached nearly 20 million tons. That's not just domestic goods. It's international freight, electronics, agricultural products, minerals, machinery, moving between China and Southeast Asia. Let's put that in perspective. Before the railway, a truck carrying goods from Kunming to Vientiane might take 3 days, depending on border delays and road conditions. The train does it in 26 hours, every time. For perishable goods, fresh fruit, vegetables, seafood, that time difference is everything. A durian that spoils before it reaches market has zero value. A durian that arrives fresh commands a premium price. Laos exports bananas, rubber, cassava, and tropical fruit to China. Previously, much of this had to move by truck or air freight, which is expensive. Now it moves by rail, which is cheaper and faster than trucks, more reliable than ships, and far cheaper than planes. But the bigger shift is that Laos is becoming a transit point for goods moving between China and Thailand. Thailand is Southeast Asia's logistics hub. It has ports, industrial capacity, and established trade networks. But Thailand doesn't border China. Moving goods between China and Thailand meant either shipping by sea, which is slow, or trucking through Myanmar or northern Thailand, which is complicated. The railway creates a third option. Goods can move from Kunming through Laos and connect to Thai rail networks once the extension is complete. This is faster than sea freight and more stable than overland routes through Myanmar. For China, this is strategic redundancy. If shipping routes are disrupted, whether by geopolitics, pandemics, or conflict, overland corridors become critical. For Laos, this is an entirely new economic role. The country isn't just exporting its own goods, it's facilitating trade between much larger economies. Here's where corridor logic starts to matter. A corridor doesn't need a large population. It doesn't need factories or tech clusters. It just needs flow. It needs goods, people, and capital moving through efficiently. Laos is now a corridor. And corridors have value, but they also have risks. The China-Laos Railway is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. That's not speculation, it's stated policy. But what does that actually mean beyond the buzzwords? The Belt and Road Initiative is a global infrastructure investment program launched by China in 2013. The idea is to build roads, railways, ports, and energy networks that connect China to Europe, Africa, Southeast Asia, and beyond. Some people see it as economic development, others see it as strategic influence. The truth is, it's both, depending on the project and the country involved. For Laos, the railway fits into a broader vision of regional connectivity. China wants a network of railways linking Kunming to Singapore, passing through Laos, Thailand, and Malaysia. This would create a direct overland route from southern China to Southeast Asia's richest markets. From China's perspective, this reduces dependence on sea routes controlled by other powers. It opens new export markets. It strengthens political and economic ties with neighboring countries. From Laos's perspective, the railway provides something the country couldn't build alone: modern infrastructure that integrates it into regional trade networks. But there's a cost. The railway cost approximately $6 billion. The financing structure is complex. 60% came from loans from China's Export-Import Bank, while 40% came from equity investments split between Chinese and Lao entities. China holds 70% of the equity stake, Laos 30%. For its portion, Laos had to borrow an additional $480 million from Chinese banks to cover part of its equity contribution. The remaining funds came from the national budget. Laos's national debt increased significantly as a result. Some analysts worry about debt sustainability. Others point out that infrastructure investments are long-term. Revenue from the railway won't materialize immediately, but it compounds over decades. What's clear is this: infrastructure isn't charity, it's alignment. China didn't build this railway out of goodwill. Laos didn't agree to it out of desperation. Both countries saw strategic value in connecting their economies. But alignment doesn't mean equality. The terms of financing, the control of operations, the distribution of revenue, these are negotiated, contested, and revised over time. Infrastructure creates relationships, and relationships involve power. Being a corridor sounds advantageous. Goods flow through, revenue flows in, trade increases, investment follows. But here's the uncomfortable question. When value moves through your country instead of being created in your country, who actually benefits? Let's break this down. The railway is operated as a joint venture between Lao and Chinese companies, but the technology, the rolling stock, the signaling systems, the maintenance protocols, all of that comes from China. Laos doesn't manufacture trains. It doesn't produce the specialized equipment needed to maintain high-speed rail. It doesn't have a deep pool of engineers trained in railway operations. This means Laos is dependent on Chinese expertise to keep the system running. That's not inherently bad, but it does create leverage. If a dispute arises over pricing, revenue sharing, or operational control, one side has more technical capacity than the other. That matters. There's also the question of value capture. When freight moves through Laos from China to Thailand, who profits? The companies shipping the goods, the logistics firms managing the transport, the railway operators collecting fees. But does Laos develop its own logistics industry? Do local companies grow by participating in these supply chains? Or do international firms dominate the corridor while Laos collects transit fees? These are open questions. The railway is still relatively new. Business models are still forming. But history suggests that being a corridor without local industrial capacity can trap countries in a service role, collecting tolls but not building wealth. Then there's the urban question. Connectivity concentrates economic activity. The railway connects Vientiane, Luang Prabang, and a few other cities. But what about the regions off the line? Infrastructure often benefits areas it directly serves while leaving others further behind. If investment, jobs, and services cluster along the railway corridor, rural provinces without access could see their populations migrate away. This isn't unique to Laos. It's a pattern in every country with major transport infrastructure. But for a small developing country, the concentration effects can be sharper. And then there's the geopolitical dimension. Laos now has a railway that physically connects it to China more directly than any other neighbor. That's infrastructure, but it's also geography rewritten. When your economy becomes structurally integrated with a larger neighbor, your room for independent decision-making shrinks. Not because of coercion, but because of interdependence. If Chinese freight is moving through Laos daily, if Chinese tourists are a major revenue source, if Chinese loans finance the infrastructure you rely on, then when Beijing speaks, Vientiane listens. That's not necessarily good or bad. It's the nature of asymmetry. Being connected doesn't mean being in control. The China-Laos Railway is less than 6 years old. That's barely enough time to measure its long-term effects. What we know so far: Passenger numbers have exceeded 43 million. Freight volume has grown from 11 million tons in 2022 to nearly 20 million tons in 2024. Tourism is recovering. Domestic connectivity has improved. But the bigger story won't be visible for years. Will Laos develop industries that benefit from the railway? Or will it remain a pass-through point for others' trade? Will the railway extension to Thailand materialize, turning Laos into a true transit corridor? Or will financing and political complications stall progress? Will the debt burden become manageable as revenue grows? Or will it constrain Laos's fiscal flexibility for decades? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're the actual uncertainties shaping Laos's future. What's undeniable is that Laos is no longer isolated. It's connected, it's accessible, it's relevant in ways it wasn't before. But proximity cuts both ways. Being closer to markets means being closer to their volatility. Being integrated into supply chains means inheriting their disruptions. Being connected to a larger economy means absorbing its pressures. Laos didn't gain a coastline. It didn't suddenly become an industrial power. It didn't transform into a regional hub overnight. What it gained was positioning. And positioning is leverage, if you know how to use it. The railway changed Laos's relationship with distance. What happens next depends on how Laos uses that change. Infrastructure isn't destiny, but it shapes the options. And for a country that spent centuries boxed in by mountains, having options is already a revolution. The question isn't whether the railway matters, it's what Laos builds around it. Let us know what you think about it in the comments section. And if this railway surprised you, wait until you see what happens when China stops building corridors and starts building territory. Watch next. China is building the world's largest island airport.